Good afternoon, John and George. Let's take a look at this week's most probed ports as well as the most probed sources in our internet weather. This is for the past week ending yesterday, which is end of the month for August. And here we are showing actually the top 10 most probed ports. The way it is actually the ranking from the last week, how much it's changed in the last column. Basically, if you look at the top three, which are 23, I ignore 8 ICMP, which is related to pings, and also 445 TCP. These are all always, I think in the past few months, if you look at, I think most of the top 5 ports are always there. They're just kind of switching the places here and there, but they're kind of staying in the top position. For example, 23, there's no change from last week to this week. And we all know 23 is typically associated with Telnet, even though it's Telnet, it's heavily abused by IoT-based botnets and as well as the Linux-based botnets. 445, there are lots of vulnerabilities, even though there are some hard bleeds as well as SMB bleed and other related exploits which target 445 TCP are prevalent. I think because of these reasons, this port is also heavily targeted by the attackers. It's interesting to see 443 TCP, which jumped actually 4 positions from last week to position number 4. But in this case, I think with the brief analysis, it seems like just increasing the volume of the traffic, nothing much. I could be able to attribute it. And at the position 5 is SSH port 22 TCP. I'm surprised to see actually it kind of dropped a couple of positions. Typically, 22 and 23, they kind of switch places at the top, like first and second positions. But nevertheless, it's still in the top 5. 3389, it remained at the 6th position, which is RDP. I guess RDP port nowadays are actually heavily used by lots of ransomwares to get into the environments, into the networks, and to stay hidden. I think it's also heavily used and heavily targeted ports. 1433 is MS SQL, one of the database server ports. 80 we all know is the typical HTTP port. I'll come back to 9th, but the rounding up at the 10th is 8545, which is Ethereum port. We talked about lots of times about Ethereum. But at the number 9 is the port 5038, which is kind of actually jumped 37 positions to crack into the top 10. What is 5038? I have a few slides actually explaining what we are seeing, what's really happening here. This is the last 30 days of graphical representation of on our common backbone traffic, what we are seeing with respect to this port. What is 5038? I think it's basically used by Asterisk Management Interface, which is like a VoIP-based service. But as you see in the last 30 days, there were like a couple of weeks actually, the number of scan probes are relatively low, but I think since a week or 10 days, it's kind of ramped up. I think because of the reason, the way our actually thresholding works, because it's been lull for a couple of weeks. Again, it came back. I think it kind of jumped so many positions to crack open into the top 10 position. And interestingly, then I try to look at the number of scanners, or rather you call a number of scan sources occurring on this port are very minimal, not many basically. I think as a matter of fact, in the last 30 days, the number of scanners actually kind of decreased from at the peak of 17 to about 4 or 5. I think I'm seeing around 6 to 7 in the last 2 days. But nevertheless, even though the number of sources have dropped, but the amount of the scanning happening has drastically increased. That's what this graph is representing. Even though the number of scanners are low, but the amount of the volume of scanning basically almost doubled. Where are these scan sources geographically distributed? Most of them are in the European region, and I think one particular scanner is coming from Singapore region. And these are basically remain constant. I think there are a couple of additions, like 1 or 2 scan IPs from the European region. But more or less, I think there are only small set of scanners happening on this port. But because of one more thing I want to point it out, 5038 typically is a low volume port in the sense, if we compare with the high volume traffic ports like 80, 443, 22 TCP, the relative volumes are relatively smaller compared to them. Because of the reason, I think even the little variation in the volume of the traffic, it reflects as a huge jump in our ranking.
So you don't think that there's a new vulnerability on that, or maybe there is?
Yeah, I think I do not know. I couldn't able to figure it out, the specific vulnerability, John. But this is based on our actually sinkholing data and some actions I could able to attribute some information to it. What's this port? Actually, that's some information I bought from the airstrip.org, what this port is used for. That's the difference there. But most of these are internet scanners. I think they're just doing the bulk scanning, and most of them are performing brute force login attempts. For example, in the right side, I kind of took out actually some information, but as you can see, there are a couple of examples. They're trying to brute force into username cron, admin. There's also asterisk, some other, I think, a different set of user and password combinations. They're constantly trying to try those combinations to get into it. As in the pie chart below, as you can see, I think 14% of the traffic we are seeing in our sinkhole data seems to be VoIP related, and about 22%, 21% is HTTP related. So I guess it's a combination of traffic happening here, but I think based on this data, I could say it's more likely some sort of, I think, brute force attempts are happening on this port. It's also the fact, I think nowadays people are working from home. If it's easier to spoof with the VoIP data. I think we can spoof the calling numbers to trick users to do something, wishing or something like that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it looks like this asterisk is a manager for like PBX systems, right?
Yes, yes.
So this would be like a perfect time. I've definitely seen an increase in robocalls on my device in the last couple of weeks or months.
Mm-hmm.
Can't believe it's been months, but so I think this is an interesting, clever moment for them to try to get themselves into a PBX central manager to try to spoof, like you said, spoof caller IDs, and because it's very easy to do that once you have control of the PBX.
Yeah, I think based on what we are seeing from our telemetry, I think that's the best guesstimate, I guess. Now, if there are no more questions, we'll move on to the more sources probing. It's similar to the previous chart, but it's now we are looking at the sources, the scan sources happening, what kind of scanning happening. Basically, again, we found the same thing again, changes from last week and what's the number this week, what's the position this week. And the top four, actually, they remain constant. I think this is what we typically see. 445, 23, 80, 14, 33. Sometimes you see 22 on the top. But at the fifth position is 53 UDP. I thought that's interesting. It's not that often we see 53 UDP cracking into the top 10. And 8080 TCP is also another alternate HTTP port. And 8 ICMP and 0 ICMP, most oftentimes they are the byproducts of DDoS attacks. I think it's a backscatter of the traffic. 22 is again SSH. 555 TCP is actually Android debug port, and even though it's used by ADB, it's most oftentimes used by lots of IoT botnets for exploitation. And looking at the 53 UDP, even though it jumped 5 positions, if I'm looking at the last 30 days, except for a couple days ago, I think over the weekend, the traffic seems to be pretty much actually constant. Here, I think I have to key in the point. In this case, we are looking at the protocol share in the sense what is the share of this specific port 53 UDP with respect to the protocol UDP. So in that scenario, there's this increase in actually traffic. That's why we saw the increase in the positioning. But nevertheless, when I looked at the traffic, there are lots of activity going on to maybe open DNS kind of lookups are happening, but nothing really malicious or maybe out of the ordinary. But based on the timeline, like it happened 2 days ago, I may be actually leaning to attribute to recent actually centrally outages happened during the weekend. Maybe during the weekend something is amiss. They're trying to look for that specific central link-based domains, and they couldn't able to resolve, and maybe they're trying to look for OpenDNS, something like that. But other than that, I couldn't able to concretely identify what is the reason for that big spike. And the next port I want to talk about is 55 TCP, as I said, Android debug port. It's also used by lots of actually small home and home routers. Again, still there's increase in traffic, but there are, I think, the increase is due to the spikes happened like a couple times. Like last week, end of last week, there's a huge spike in the number of volume of the flows, as well as the little spikes in the last 2 days. So again, looking at our telemetry data, it looks like actually it's looking for confirmation. It's basically looking for ADB, which is a Android debug port. And also basically there are a couple of malware actually using this port propagated. There's a good write-up actually by Trend Labs about this 555 TCP usage by one of the botnets. I guess that kind of confirms from our telemetry data also what are the activities happening is related to, in fact, to the ADB. Again, the pie chart here gives the breakdown of what we're really seeing it. About 43% is ADB, and there's some mix of HTTP. In the sense, I think nowadays, most of the scanners, they try to brute force each and every port to open with the different password combinations. So I'm not surprised to see HTTP also here, but the key point is the ADB is definitely involved in this case also.
It's interesting. I'm always a little concerned about that 5555, with the ADB, just because Android is such a prevalent device, and people don't, they often turn that on. It requires a lot of work to actually do it, but there's surprisingly a number of people who turn that on to be internet facing.
I think that's what the bad actors are looking for, under the radar ports, which by default will be open.
Yeah, and we know RDP has been huge since the stay-at-home, right? Because a lot of companies standing up, servers to be accessed remotely and just bringing them up without applying any kind of security or maybe out-of-the-box security, and just trying to get people working again and not thinking through it. So I know RDP was huge.
Yeah, that's always the case. I think as long as I remember, at least this RDP port is always in the top position.
Yeah.
Yeah, always.
Yeah.